relates to the topic that you're covering at the time. And so now I'll hand over to you, Lisa. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much. Welcome, everybody. I'm a very cynical journalist. So years ago, I wanted to plan my own funeral. I'm a single independent woman, and I wanted to make sure everything was taken care of before I died. We're pretty pragmatic in my family. We're very straight down the line. And I couldn't find the information I needed to plan my own funeral. So I started looking around, and I just started picking up the phones and calling funeral directors, morticians, whoever who would talk to me about death and dying, because this was probably 11 or 12 years ago now. And while there's been a bit of a change now, back then, funeral directors didn't have social media presences. Morticians didn't talk about their days on social media. It was still very considered taboo. It was very difficult to get on the media, on radio or TV, talking about death and dying, because it was still very, oh no, we don't do that kind of thing. So I'm pleased to say that this is slowly changing. A lot to do with social media, people like me on social media, like I said, funeral directors sharing what they do, getting people thinking about their mortality. And there's lots more information online about all sorts of things. But back when I started writing the Bottom Drawer book and calling around funeral directors, I didn't plan to write a book. I just wanted to find stuff out for my own information. And then as I got going and it got so interesting and so fascinating, I thought, well, I've got all this information, I may as well share it. So that's how the Bottom Drawer book came about. And I had delightfully candid chats with funeral directors and everyone involved in the death and dying industry, palliative care nurses, all that kind of thing. So it was then that I realized that it needn't be morbid. It's a very interesting part of our lives, and very much so it is part of our lives. It's not our life and then death happens. It's part of our lives, which is what I'm here to discuss today, is how we make it part of our lives. So you should be able to see my screen. I had so much fun writing the Bottom Drawer book. I didn't tell many people I was writing it, purely because I thought that they would think I was a little bit crazy, because again, back then it was seen as quite a morbid thing to do. So today, I hope will add to your understanding of death and dying and funerals. And I'd like you to think about yours and what you would like, because your story is really important. The more we understand that death is inevitable, it allows us to focus on life and make every moment count. So the things that are discussed in the book are simple things. Do you want to be buried or cremated? It's incredible how many people I speak with who've lost their partner, whose partner have died, and they didn't even know if they wanted their partner, if their partner wanted to be cremated or buried. They never even broached that really broad subject, let alone getting to the nitty-gritty of whether that person wanted a cheap coffin or a big, expensive hardwood casket, or how they wanted to be remembered at their memorial. Did they want their funerals, you know, the church or wherever they were being memorialized, covered in their favorite flowers? Or did they think flowers are a waste of money? And perhaps they'd rather some money to go to their favorite charity. And another big one, what do I dress my loved one in? It's really quite interesting how much angst something so seemingly simple can create at a time of great grief and confusion. So they're the kind of things I encourage people to think about and write their answers in the Bottom Drawer book. So when the time comes, all this information is there for their loved one. So at a time of grieving, it doesn't need to be a really sad, confusing occasion. They can focus on the death and the grief as opposed to getting stuff sorted. That's one of the illustrations in the Bottom Drawer book. You know, funerals don't have to be wearing black these days. It is accepted to even follow themes. I used to tease my friends that I wanted a Wizard of Oz funeral, and I expected all of them to get dressed up as a character from the Wizard of Oz. I've since changed that idea. And this is the layout of the book. It's colourful, it's vibrant, it's inoffensive. And this was really important when I was devising the book, coming up with the book, that I didn't want the cliched, walking off into the sunset. That's just dull and boring, and it doesn't resonate with anyone. If people are going to talk about death, they want to be entertained, and they don't want to think it's dark. Hence the use of colour in the bottom drawer book. Now, this is Tisha at my post office in Leeburn in Southern Downs, Queensland. Tisha greets me every day with the books that I send out. And unbeknown to me, this young woman in her 20s has this tattoo on her thigh. She was inspired similarly to me. She was reading The Mexican Way of Death. And there are many variants of what she's got tattooed on her leg. But the most important one, and the one that really affects our ego, is the third time you die is the last time someone ever mentions your name. And that sits really hard, because we might be remembered for 2 generations, maybe 3 generations. But after that, our names aren't going to be remembered. Hopefully the work we've done is remembered. The changes we've contributed to are remembered. But Banksy said something similar. Banksy's a satirist, activist, street artist. And he said in an interview, they say you die twice. The first time when you stop breathing, the second time when somebody says your name for the last time. Again, that's ego-driven. Does it matter? And of course, this is a rhetorical question. Does it matter that no one mentions our name in a couple of generations' time? Mourning death or celebrating life. This book is very secular for a reason that religion is personal, as is death is personal. And I find a lot of people come to me and tell about the arguments they have with their partner because their partner wants to be cremated. And the other partner says, there's no way I'm burning you, I'm going to bury you. And so there's this discourse of even people, soulmates, so to speak, don't see eye to eye. And so no one size fits all. Everyone's got their own personal views, both about their religion and their beliefs, and also what they want for your funeral. So I specifically kept the bottom drawer book very secular. Particularly Western society, that's me. In Australia, we're so bad at death. We don't talk about it. It's considered morbid. We have our heads in the sand about that kind of thing. So I hate to break it to you. And the next part of the conversation is going to be fairly blunt. And the good thing about Zoom is if it is confronting to you, feel free to go away and make yourself a cup of tea, give yourself some space. A couple of years ago, the latest statistics from the Australian Bureau of Statistics showed that, almost 172,000 people died in Australia. Worldwide, it's about that every day. So today in Australia, there's almost 500 people dying. In Nepal, for example, there's about 560 dying, so 23 people per hour. That's a lot of death across the world. Certainly at the same time, there's a lot of life. There's lots of people being born, but there's also a lot of people dying. So you can either be prepared for it, give your loved ones a bit of an inkling of what you might like at your end of life, or you might not. As we know, the image on the screen is dark and it's morbid, and that's what we've often grown up to believe about death. It's dark and it's scary and the Grim Reaper comes, and that's why we're so ill-equipped to deal with death. We just don't talk about it and we don't know about it. So that's why I'm really excited that there's so many online today so that we can have that discussion. The first thing I like to tell people is death is a business. As much as I dislike that fact, there are a lot of people making a lot of money out of death. And certainly they do wonderful work, but we just have to make sure that they're earning our money at the end of life. There is Australia's largest funeral provider is called InvoCare. About 1 in 3 funeral directors are owned by this corporate conglomerate. Last year provided almost 40,000 funerals across Australia. The average cost per funeral was $8,000, and that's climbing to about $8,500. And that's just the funeral and possibly a cremation. On top of that is the burial fee, the burial ground, the grave. That can vary from probably about $4,000 from a regional centre up to tens of thousands of dollars to your metropolitan centres. It's a lot of money. Cemeteries and funerals are quite costly, not to mention the huge memorial costs. Even just little brass plaques being made add to the cost of a funeral. And just in case you didn't need any more convincing that dying is big business, InvoCare, of course, is a listed company on the Australian Stock Exchange, so they have to report to their shareholders, and they've taken a different tack these days. I'm pleased to say their CEO has changed hands, so the reports don't look quite like this. But it was almost like they were celebrating, yay, it's a great time to buy shares in InvoCare because look at the long-term industry fundamentals. Deaths are going to increase to 240,000 per annum by 2034. So that's only 11 years away. And we know now, you saw in that previous slide, that 177,000 people died in Australia 2 years ago. Well, just by 2034, which isn't far away, that's going to jump to 240,000. But yay, if you've got shares, you know, so there's money in death. This is a pie chart. It's old, but it's still pretty significant. When you do pay for a funeral, when the professional services fee, i.e. you actually pay the funeral director thousands of dollars to make a few calls, to organise some sandwiches, that kind of thing. So it's a significant cut of what you're paying your funeral director for. And don't get me wrong, they do amazing work. At a time of grief and confusion, you want someone balanced. You want someone who's going to sit quietly while the argument goes in the kitchen about what your loved one wants. You can see the coffin is a considerable piece of that pie. Coffins can be, you know, tens of thousands of dollars, or they can be inexpensive cardboard coffins versus your hardwood, polished, or even metal coffins, more commonly used overseas than Australia. And that's the question. How fancy does your coffin need to be? Ask your loved one. Get permission from your loved one to spend less than $1,000 on their coffin. Or they might say, nope, I want top of the range. I expect you to spend $10,000 on my coffin. But at least have that conversation. So when, you know, Joe from up the road sticks his head into the funeral and go, oh, that wasn't a very nice coffin that Mary had, you know, the husband can say, well, that's what Mary wanted. Mary wanted a cardboard coffin and she wanted everyone in the town to write their final messages on it. So give your loved ones permission to either buy an expensive coffin or a cheap coffin. It comes down to it's your funeral, so make it your own. Anything you want is just about doable. Long gone are the, oh, somebody dies, you've got to have a church service in a chapel. That's not on anymore. People have realised that funerals can be as personal as that person. If they enjoyed a game of golf twice a week, why not have the funeral at the golf club on the 18th hole, for example? If they have a favourite footy team, why not have the funeral at their footy club? There are lots of choices these days. And while you're paying that funeral director lots of money for their great service, you may as well make them earn it by organising at your footy club instead of your local church, for example. So I have to give you a warning. My favourite topic is body disposal, or it's called disposition. So with all those people dying all over the world, you know, about 160, 170,000 today, that leaves a lot of bodies that have to be dealt with, be it by burial or however you get rid of them. And there are lots of emerging options as well as the traditional options these days. And I'm just going to go through a few of these. Again, I'll be talking fairly bluntly about these methods, They are very interesting though, but feel free to excuse yourself if it's a little bit close to the bone. That pun was not intended, by the way. So this, first thing I noticed about this photograph is colour. There's no black here. This was the funeral held late last year of a Vietnamese Buddhist monk who pioneered the concept of mindfulness. This photo shows that peace activist funeral procession through central Vietnam. You'll see that big casket being wheeled on a carriage. That's not actually the casket or coffin that person is being disposed of or being cremated in. That's just a ceremonial casket. It's most likely that the deceased is laying inside that in a bamboo coffin. So that huge ceremonial casket is simply for appearances. It's been used many times before, and it will be used many times in the future. Interestingly, this particular person's ashes were not kept in a stupa, and we'll get to stupas in just a moment. They're big memorial towers almost. The deceased had his cremains or ashes scattered at plum village centres or schools of Buddhism and monasteries right around the world. So when I was in Cambodia, same but different. This is something on a smaller scale. So this ceremonial wagon was free for anyone to use who was using the local crematorium. I mentioned stupas. These pretty much house the cremated remains of families of several generations. The urns of the family elders are placed on the top shelf of the 3 internal shelves, and subsequent generations are on the lower shelves. These are really expensive, and I can't quite get my head around the cost of death because much expense is spent on these buildings. These are about $3,000 at the time, which was several years ago. It was $3,000 US to build one of these stupas. And it's interesting to me that the average Cambodian struggles to make $1.50 US per day. But the extravagance of these stupas was really quite interesting. On the right, the photo on the right-hand side, the little pink building, that's the crematorium. So they really are very close to the stupas and the places of worship. Just an example of how far cremation goes back. I visited Angkor Wat, and just near there, this was actually a Hindu temple, but that big building on the left-hand side, that was a crematorium, believed to be a crematorium for men. So the significance of cremations and fire cremations, of disposing of bodies, is obviously centuries and centuries, thousands of years old. Now, have a look at the amount of wood that is under this particular pyre. There's a lot of wood there. And we know, we've discussed how many people die every year. And obviously we don't do this in Australia, but this is a very, very common practice overseas, these pyres all over the world. I was lucky enough to go to a conference a few months ago, Redesigning Death Care in Melbourne, where I met Dr. Vinat Arora from India, and they were working on the environmental consequences of these kind of pyres, the huge resources of wood used to cremate people. 4.15 million tonnes of wood every year, 50 to 60 million trees. That's a lot of trees and a lot of greenhouse gases when it comes to the cremation of people. So there are people working very hard all around the world to try and change those cultural practices, of readjust their thinking. While many people want to be buried on pyres, the environmental consequences these days are quite significant. So we discussed, or she presented about a make-do kind of cremation facility. This was designed by a local farmer. You just put wood within that cement structure, And instead of 500 kilos or 400 kilos of wood, it just burns 100 kilos of wood. So there's a lot of work being done behind the scenes around the world to look at the environmental consequences of body disposal. Of course, we don't do that here in Australia. It's illegal, thankfully. We use mainly gas cremators. You can see there's the one on the left is one of 6 that are on the Gold Coast. The one on the right is at actually the Mount Gravatt Cemetery in Brisbane. And they're just big furnaces, so to speak. Each cremation is said to release 160 kilograms of greenhouse gases, not to mention the wood that's involved in burning coffins, the maintenance of cemeteries. It's not very environmentally conscious. We hear about the shortage of gas. We hear about the price of gas as well. The gas used in Australia is usually about LPG. Overseas in Europe, there's often skewing to electrical furnaces, but not much here in Australia is done by electrical. So this is a page from my book where I talk about emerging technologies. Again, as I mentioned, lots of people are working behind the scenes to work out environmentally conscious ways of disposing of bodies of our loved ones. This one, alkaline hydrolysis or water cremation, is legal in 26 states in the United States, though it's not active in 26 states. It is legal in parts of Australia, and there is a facility in Victoria near the New South Wales Victoria border. What this is water cremation. I guess it gives you the same results as cremation. In the end, are the ashes, or what's called cremains, cremated remains, after the process. So instead of fire burning the remains, there's a potassium liquid, so 5% potassium and 95% water, heated under pressure, and the building blocks of our bodies are broken down. There's the issue with flame cremation, as well as the resources and the fossil fuels used in gas cremation, is also, I'm sure we've all got mercury in our teeth. Mercury then becomes those airborne emissions, which is of great concern. This alkaline hydrolysis, this not so much dissolving, but the breaking down of the proteins, of the carbohydrates of our genetic material, is 7 times less energy on this. So the carbon footprint is reduced around 6 times when using this up-and-coming alkaline hydrolysis. It's just the same. You can still have the same funeral process, but the body is used, is disposed of, so to speak, is broken down differently. There's also human composting, natural organic reduction. This is not available in Australia. I think the 6th state in the United States has just approved this. This is, I think a lot of us would probably have compost heaps in the backyard. Exactly the same thing. This process that we can see here, somebody has been laid in. So the laying in on wood chips, alfalfa, then you would add a little bit of heat because your compost bin gets quite warm. Same thing with this. You'd add some water. Within a month, the body is broken down substantially. Within another month, that body is soil, a very rich soil. So then in this particular facility in Seattle, in the United States, they take, if the family don't want that rich soil to come home for their garden, they go to big forests that are in need of love and care and rehabilitate them using the soil of broken down humans. In Australia, natural burial is something that's taking off. This is at the Gold Coast, halfway between Brisbane and the Gold Coast. In the foreground, you can see the traditional cemetery. In the background is a little bit of bushland. So within that bushland is the natural burial site. So
Lisa,
Yes,
Annie Zongmo has a question,
fantastic.
and it is incredibly interesting for all of us here to hear of these environmental ways that are being developed. And Annie Zongmo wants to know, how expensive is the water system and composting compared with gas cremation?
Yeah, it looks like in Australia it will be similar kind of costs. It's certainly not cheaper. And because it is new technology, there are several companies working on alkaline hydrolysis. So you're going to have your BMW service with alkaline hydrolysis, and you're going to have your Hyundai versions of alkaline hydrolysis. It's kind of like your Simplicity funerals versus your white lady funerals, high end. So at this stage, it's looking like it will be comparative. It won't be cheaper, but it will be comparative to the others. Human composting, if you go to recompose.com, Recompose in the United States is that particular photo I showed you earlier. That is one company. So it's called recompose.com. They will have a price list on there as well. It's probably a little bit expensive, maybe, in fact, I'm not going to quote it, but there is a price list on their website. But it's starting to look like it's comparative. Not more expensive, not cheaper.
Thanks, Lisa.
And you raise a good point too. The price of natural burial is the same in most situations as your normal burial gravesite, even though bushland like this doesn't need a lot of maintenance. You know, it doesn't need the grass watered and mowed and that kind of thing. So this is a natural burial ground. Bodies are buried at a lower depth, as bodies are buried shallower than a traditional burial. They're buried in natural fabrics. The perfect fabric is silk because it will break down. Of course, you know, you can't bury someone in their polyester footy jacket because we know that polyester will stay in the earth for hundreds of years. No chemicals used. So if you are using a coffin, there can't be any lacquers, any glues. So it needs to be as natural as possible to make the human at one with the earth as much as possible. So that's natural burial. And again, just in the last 10 years since I've started writing the bottom drawer book, there was only 2 back then. And now most cemeteries are starting to look at a natural burial ground attached to their traditional burial ground. There are no plaques, there are no memorials, headstones or anything like that. There's a couple of ways to find out where Auntie Mary is. One is GPS coordinates, and the second, probably a little bit more accurate, is chips. Just like you get your dog, a chip in your dog, and you go to the vet and the vet scans the microchip and finds out all the information. A chip would be buried with the body at the foot end of the body, and that's how you might be able to find, or you would be able to find Auntie Mary in these natural burial grounds. So they really do go to earth. Let's see. I really enjoy this app that's on my phone. It's We Croak, and it's free. I mentioned earlier, or an earlier slide spoke about in Bhutan, they say that thinking about death 5 times a day will make you happier. And the theory is, just as I opened this discussion, is the theory is that the more you understand death, the more you choose to live your life every day. So if you're into apps, if you've got a smartphone and this kind of appeals to you, this is what I get 5 times a day. I get a little thing, don't forget, you're going to die. And then you open it up for the quote. And these were just the quotes that were yesterday and today. And I really like Andrea's quote. And you can submit your own quotes, which I think is wonderful. I have cancer, and I know that once you get the diagnosis, no matter how much you already know, something happens. Everything becomes much more real. Ironically, it brings greater permission to be fully alive. I find it very exciting. Isn't that a wonderful, glorious way to look at death? Andrea has worked out that, yes, I'm going to die, but I've got all this time to live until I die. And that's a really reflective way, I think, to be able to approach your own death. So that's a little hot tip from me. We croak. It doesn't have ads. It doesn't ask you for any money, nothing like that. But it's just, it's pretty cool to have on your phone. So the bottom drawer book, it's available online to purchase, or there is an ebook available. The ebook you can't write in for obvious reasons, and it's an ebook, but I encourage people to write down to get a notebook and to write down their thoughts, their corresponding thoughts to the ebook. I'd really like you to follow me on Facebook. I have heaps of blogs and heaps of information. I just yearn for more information. So I go down rabbit holes all the time. So please, thebottomdrawerbook.com.au, there is a blog there about all sorts of things. So this one is really important. We only live once, Snoopy. Well, no, that's wrong. We only die once. We get to live every day. Now, you mentioned I'm a cemetery wanderer, and I really enjoy wandering through cemeteries. And again, it comes down to wonderful stories. I find cemeteries are pretty much like libraries. There are books. Every one of those is a book or a chapter. We just have to take the time to sit and read that book or look at that chapter. I understand there are many people from overseas who will be watching this. This is an Indigenous burial ground in the Dampier Peninsula in Western Australia. It's, as you can see, it's very simple. The mission was called, or is called, Lombardina, and the water table is very shallow in the area, so that impacted the depth that these bodies could be buried in. But also, and you probably can't see it now, but you'll see lots of white on each of those graves. There's shells on those graves because the people of Lombardina, of the Dampier Peninsula in Western Australia, were saltwater people. So, of course, it makes sense that there are wonderful decorations of simple, very simple but effective shells on their graves. You'll also see shells on white people's graves. And the reason for that is, again, it comes down to symbolism, that here the Bardi people are saltwater people, but obviously have an affinity for the sea. But in Australia, if you see shells on a grave, it's because one of the popular theories about seashells on graves originates in Greek mythology, where Aphrodite, the goddess of love, was born from sea foam and then was carried to shore in a seashell. Regarded by some as a source of life, the hard shell protects a soft living being. This can be an analogy of someone who's died. While the human body may be devoid of life, their soul continues to live. The dead body's shell is only a covering for the soul that is alive within. So symbolism is very important in life and in death, and cemeteries and the way those people are remembered. Another reason cemeteries for me are particularly important is because they're the keepers of our history, particularly our pioneering history. We have, white Australia is a very young history, but already we're running the chance that it will be lost a lot because people are getting cremated. So where are their stories kept if everyone's being cremated? So this is why this is a grave that is in the middle of nowhere in Old Hawes Creek in the Kimberley and the Northern Territory. And in 1917, poor old James Darcy died just 29 years old. He suffered internal injuries in a fall. He was very remote. 1927, it's not like you get, or 1917, you can't exactly pick up the phone. So the local postmaster, like the local post office guy, he did surgery on Jim Darcy using a silver pocket knife. There was no doctor available, obviously, because it was the middle of nowhere. So the postmaster, Fred Tuckett, took instructions from his old first aid teacher in Perth via telegram. And the surgery was amazingly successful. Can you imagine? There would have been no, it just paints a picture of our pioneering history and our past and how difficult times were. Could you imagine going under the knife without anaesthetic? A pocket knife held by your mate who happens to be the post office guy. The surgery was successful, but Jim succumbed to a relapse of malaria, aged 29. So that's why I think cemeteries are really, really important. So something I'm really interested in speaking with you about, and your Buddhist practicing, or practice I should call it, is how this sits with you, knowing that there's an afterlife, knowing that enlightenment will come. Is the method of body disposal important to you? Because I understand Buddhists, same as Hindus, for example, believe in cremation. So I'm interested to know in where that sits with you, knowing that environmentally it may not be the best thing. And that's something I grapple with often, is religion versus the practicalities of death. So I invite questions now, whether you want to address that, or there's all sorts of other things to do with death, dying and funerals that I'd love to answer your questions about.
Annie Zangma, would you like to speak to that?
No.
Cremation is the preferred method. And of course, in our traditional practices in countries like Nepal, Bhutan, India, which you've obviously, Cambodia, Thailand, which you seem to have travelled in. Yes, the pile of wood, the very scarce pile of wood is usually the way that it happens. To find a more, the environmental aspect is only really a recent thing that we've become aware of. And it would probably be interesting to ask one of our friends from Bhutan about it, because they're about the most environmental people in Asia, and to hear how they feel about it. And Kamala was saying, I love the idea of composting. That looks amazing. And I was thinking the same thing. And we could grow more trees with the compost.
That's exactly right. And the soil is so rich, it needs to be diluted depending on the company that does it. They have same, but different formula for how they break down bodies, the compost method, between 4 parts human soil versus 1 part normal soil. That's how nutrient rich our bodies are. And I went to a lecture with the inventor of this Recompose, or the owner of the company, and she was saying, because I said, what does it smell like? And she said, it's fascinating that people have their own smell in life. So when they're composted, would you believe it? People have their own smell once they're composted. She said,
we all smell like incense.
Well, she said some people are really sweet, and others are more tart, so to speak. Yeah, it's good. Unfortunately, the technology, there's no legislation within Australia yet that would allow human composting. Also, there was a group of people that looked into bringing the technology here, and this was only last year, because this has only been the last few years of human composting. It was going to cost about $1.5 million to bring that technology here. And when you think that technology would probably only be able to compost 8 people at a time, and it would take a minimum of a month for those people, the economies of scale for that kind of investment would be prohibitive. So I wouldn't imagine human composting would be available in Australia for a considerable amount of time. I wouldn't imagine seeing that within 5 to 10 years. No. The alkaline hydrolysis is available in Australia. It's a lower technique. So there are 2 techniques with alkaline hydrolysis. There is the heating of the remains within that big cylinder, that aluminium cylinder, to about 90 degrees, but not under pressure. And that takes longer. So that can take anything upwards of 8 hours. Whereas there's the BMW technology, like that was the Hyundai technology I just described. The BMW technology is pressurized. So the water doesn't boil. It's 150 degrees, but because it's under pressure, the water stays water. It doesn't turn to a gas. So it doesn't boil. And that will take about 3 to 4 hours. That technology, don't tell anyone, but I've got a feeling that technology will be here actively within a year or 2. So that's just around the corner. And it's going to be very interesting to have how the marketing campaign of that is going to work. Sure, on one hand, it's very environmentally conscious, but on the other hand, you're going to get all these people going, oh, you're dissolving my nan in acid, which couldn't be anything further from the truth. It's just speeding up the very natural process. But yes, so alkaline hydrolysis won't be too far away. Anna's got a question. Do you have to have a coffin in Australia, or can a body be just put in the ground? Really good question. Again, this is something that has changed within the last 10 years or so. You can use a shroud. Up until about 10 years, you had to get permission from the health department to be able to bury your loved one in a shroud. And you had to say, for religious beliefs, I want to use a shroud. For example, Islam will only bury in shrouds. Whereas now, lots of people are choosing to be buried in a shroud. And a shroud is anything, it's a fabric that will break down in the earth. You can either buy a shroud, and there are companies who make shrouds in Australia, and they can be fairly expensive, like the same price as a coffin. Or you could just use a sheet, like 3 or 4 sheets, and use that shroud. So no, a body cannot just be laid in the ground. Unfortunately, in Australia, even with a shroud, there will have to be some plastic in the bottom of the shroud. Again, I'm going to talk fairly bluntly, because the body at times does purge and does leak. So for health reasons, that has to be minimised. So even in a shroud, there might be a layer of hopefully a biodegradable plastic. What happens with the remains in hydrology method? That's a great question. So the alkaline hydrolysis, first of all, the bones. Let's talk about the bones of alkaline hydrolysis. There are more ashes left after the process, because in fire cremation, the particulate matter, so tiny little bits of bone, burn and go up the stack and are lost. However, with the aquamation or the alkaline hydrolysis, the bones stay whole and they're very soft and very brittle. So they will have to be broken down, sort of like they're pulverized for about 20 seconds in a special machine. And so you're left with this fine powdery ash, versus cremains after a fire cremation. They're not ashes at all. They're actually little bits of grit, little bits of bone, because that's what they are. It's similar to if you go to a beach, we know a beach and sometimes it's quite gritty and there's little bits of coral that you put your toe on and it hurts. That's what's the results of fire cremation, whereas the aquamation or the alkaline hydrolysis is a soft powder. So you'll get more ashes left, more remains, I should call them, from an alkaline hydrolysis process. So there is water there, and I think it's about 1,500 litres in the resumation, the BMW company, for example, there's about 1,500 litres of water left. That water is sterile and it has no DNA whatsoever. The only hassle with that water is a very high pH. So you've got a pH scale of 1 to 14. The 1 is pretty much your acid, your lemons, for example. The 14 is where your water would be after being alkaline hydrolysized. So if you ever drink antacid, if you've got reflux and you drink antacid, that's exactly what that pH is. So some people wouldn't mind a 14 pH put on their gardens, but it's not ideal. So ideally that water would be treated to bring that pH back to a pH of 10. So then there's 1,500 litres of water that could be reused in the garden or wherever. Is there any way you can be cremated on private property? None whatsoever. In Australia, no. Even it used to be, you can be buried on private property. Depending on the state, it's about 5 hectares of land that you will have, that you can be buried on. You've got to jump through a few hoops. Depending on the council, will depend how much homework you've got to do. They will ask for proof that, Auntie Mary's not going to pollute the local river system or the neighbour's paddock, for example. And that can be quite costly, getting a hydrographer in, maybe a geologist or whatever, to make sure that where you're burying that person is okay. But as for cremation on a private property, no. Several reasons for that. The environmental consequences. In Australia, you've got that mercury going up. You would also need a very large fire, burning at 5 hours with lots of wood, and yeah, it's just not something that's done in Australia, nor will it ever be done in Australia. In the United States, there is one burial ground or one facility in Colorado called, I think it's Crestone, that has an open pyre for people in that community. And that's the only one in the whole of the United States. So it'll never happen here in Australia. Not allowed.
Yeah, that's a Tibetan Buddhist community in Crestone. Yeah.
They do wonderful work. Again, go to the website, Google Crestone. And what I really like about that community is that it's not just the people involved with the pyre, the cremation that's involved on that day. All the whole surrounding community are volunteers. So there's a volunteer organising the parking. There's someone with the catering. It's a whole community thing, which is really important, because you can imagine trying to get permission from the local council, from the local government in America to burn someone on a bunch of wood. That, the neighbours would just go, they wouldn't be very happy anywhere else. But because this is such a whole community involved in this, that Crestone is actually working. But no, please look up, Google Crestone cremation or Crestone, Colorado, and it'll come up. It's wonderful. Yeah, I agree. There's a comment here. I love the idea of composting. That looks amazing, and could grow trees. Yes. Oh, while I've got you, I'm just going to share my screen again, because we talk about cremains or cremated cremains after a fire. So I blogged about this because just with everything like death and dying, there are consequences of scattering ashes. So this is one of the blogs. You may have seen this photo in the media. Crystal Clayton spread some of her nan's ashes at the Sydney cricket ground. And I thought this was amazing that she just happened to have them in her pocket. And when everyone stormed the field after Buddy Franklin kicked his 1000th AFL goal, she was able to run on there and scatter her nan's ashes on the SCG. Unfortunately, that's not ideal. There's a couple of reasons why. Again, because cremated remains, as I mentioned, are gritty. So there would literally be little bits of grit on that football field. So if a player's taking the tackle and he comes down on that grit, he's going to have bits of her nan in his knee, which isn't ideal. But also, when it comes to scattering ashes, these cremains are a very high pH, and this alkalinity can be toxic to plants. So any nutrient values the bones held before cremation are null and void after the cremation, because they become locked away and unusable. So when you scatter ashes, you may as well be scattering salt. And that's something that no one has ever spoken about in Australia. But I think now we can finally say, hey, you know, you're scattering ashes. Because I always worry that there's going to be somebody who's going to scatter their Auntie Mary in her favourite goldfish pond. And it's all about dilution, obviously. But you can imagine just pouring maybe 1 or 2 kilos of cremains in a freshwater pond. All those fish are going to die. Simple as that. So it's all about dilution. Certainly scatter the ashes, but make sure you don't put them all together, because tree roots, for example, will try and go around them as much as they can, but it's not ideal. Fun fact today. There you go.
Oh, that's really interesting to know, Lisa, because we're part of our custom is to put ashes, but quite often we make small clay little statues, and we put or little stupas, and we put the ashes in those, and we place those in pilgrimage places, in holy sites and sacred places. And but I guess, you know, for here in Australia, the idea of putting the ashes in the ocean, which a lot of people do, is okay because of them being salt anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's all about dilution. Yeah. And there are also companies overseas that will make artificial reefs with ashes. So they'll put ashes in the cement, a cement shape, for example, and then wonderful, it forms a reef. I love that idea. Oh, here in Singapore, we have this new Garden of Peace. Excellent. I will suss that out. Thank you very much, Lizzie. Oh, and they charge $320, including GST, to scatter ashes at that Garden of Peace. See, death. It's expensive, isn't it? Any other questions? Just feel free to pipe up.
More a comment. Thank you so much for your research. It's fantastic. I can see your enthusiasm. So it's just really wonderful to hear about it. Thank you.
Great. I'm glad I didn't scare everyone off.
Oh, no.
I don't think you'd scare us. I don't think you'd scare us off. This is very sorts of things that we're really interested in.
Excellent. You're my people. This is the thing. Love it. Excellent. Yeah, Wendy, I totally agree. Funerals should be a celebration of the person's life and uplifting for the family. My brother's best schoolyard friend died 2 weeks ago, and he rang me and said, Lisa, I need one of your books. And because Richard's funeral was held in a church, and sometimes Christian funerals are not really about the person. They're about the religion. They're about the God. And this wasn't Richard whatsoever. He was a criminal lawyer. He was, he was a big drinker. He was larger than life. And yet his ex-wife decided that a church was where the funeral was going to be. So it wasn't representative of Richard whatsoever. But thankfully, people then got together afterwards and had their own private memorial at the local footy club, where all the old boys and all the footy players, partied like Richard would have partied. But you're absolutely right. The time is for remembering those people. I call it lifestyle meeting death style, how they live their life and how they die. It should be very similar. Is regular coffin cemetery burial taking too much resources, space too? Oh, absolutely. You can just Google overpopulation of cemeteries, and there's just no room. There are so many cemeteries in Australia that have no room anymore. So it's a big thing. I think it's 260 hectares in Melbourne, a place called Harkness, that the Melbourne Cemeteries Trust is now working on. It's absolutely massive. And what's exciting about that particular new cemetery is that they've heaps of community consultation. What do you want at your cemetery? So there's going to be cafes, there's going to be picnic areas and, you know, swings, and they really want to make it a community space because, as you know, we no longer talk about death. Cemeteries were once a place people picnicked in to visit their loved ones, but now cemeteries are like, ooh, ghosty, who'd go to a cemetery. But it's really important that if we want to respect our dead, we visit our dead and their special places, for example. So yes, very much so. Burial is taking a lot of room, and something, yeah, it's how practical is it? And that's why there are several states in Australia, including New South Wales, who have introduced a 25-year term for a grave. Up until now, if you were buried in somewhere like Victoria or Queensland, you were buried for good, perpetuity. But now they're giving a 25-year tenure option. And then you can extend that. It's going to cost you. But to be honest, there's not going to be much left after 25 years. So when you're memorializing or when you're keeping a grave, you virtually are, the grave is not a grave anymore. It's simply a bit of dirt with an expensive memorial on the top with a gravestone. So that's something else to consider. It's funny, Australians, oh boy, when talk of the 25-year grave tenure was discussed and came up, there was, people lost their mind, saying this is disgusting. How could you just, let them rest in peace? Whereas we're so lucky in Australia. There are countries that a grave tenure is a couple of years, and the family has to go in and retrieve the remains of their loved one, which are often still pretty much intact, and then, excuse me, put them in what's called an ossuary box, and then it's shelled at that cemetery. Wendy writes, I did a funeral this week and we were all in colour and the coffin left to the tune of the Hawthorn Football Club with scarves on all of us. Exactly. Fantastic. What a way to remember that person. And you start your grieving process knowing that, that was fun. We remembered that person, how he lived his life. So it really does help with the grieving process. So many times I've heard, oh my gosh, he would have hated that and that's how you remember that person initially. It's like, he had a terrible funeral. So yeah, funerals are as personal as you are.
Lisa, you said you changed your theme. What's your current theme plan?
Great question. I'm not having a funeral. Yes. And this is a very popular trend. It started emerging 10 years ago. And again, now it's very, very popular. People decide not to have a funeral. It's like, okay, just get rid of my body and then you'll have me in an urn. Then I'll have a memorial party, put me in, put the urn on the bar, something like that. So that's the next big thing in the funeral industry, is not even having a funeral, avoiding the pomp and ceremony and the ritual of the funeral and just having a memorial at someone else's, on your own time. And so that's what I don't want a funeral. So I will not be having a funeral. I will be having a cremation. And again, I don't expect people to get together. In my will, I have asked them to visit various places around Australia. I travel a lot and there's a lot to be learned from Indigenous areas, and I want them to go visit remote and Indigenous Australia. That's my wish. That they'll don't tell any of my friends because they don't know about that. That's in my will. So yeah. Yes.
Thank you.
Lizzie writes, just sharing, here in Singapore, if family and friends attend a funeral wake wearing colourful clothing, they will usually be deemed disrespectful. Yeah, totally agree with that. That's something, again, that's cultural. There are some cultures where the families wear white in mourning and the rest of the mourners are expected to wear black. But yeah, in Western culture, that is changing. Again, it comes down to what do you want? If it's written down in something like the bottom drawer book, hey, I want everyone to wear pink or hawthorn scarves or anything, while some may look down upon that, you can say, but no, this is what they wanted. They wrote it down. So we're fulfilling the wishes. It's all about that conversations before you die.
Yeah, we really understand from the studies we had last year that writing down is just so important. And that's where I feel your book is really precious, because yeah, you can fill in all the different parts and know that it's all done, and yeah, have a really good record.
And that's the thing, it's all done. Once it's done, it's like, okay, I can now go and live my life.
Yes.
However long that may be. And what I like and what's really popular about the book, and I get emails every other day from people, I ask for people's life reflections, like what are the most outrageous things you've done? What have been your life's most valuable lessons? Do you have any messages for people? What things about yourself and your life are you most proud of? And the amount of people who've emailed me and said, we literally just copied everything as their eulogy because it was all there. So that's another thing. It's your story. They might not agree with it. They could say that in, the eulogy, Auntie Mary reckons she did this, but you know what? She was a pain when she did that. But yeah, it just offers an insight. And also, as you say, it's really good to reflect on that stuff, because you can also reflect on what comes after you finish the book. And that is, I get to live my life now. And you know what? I'm really happy with the way I live my life, but I could work on this. So I'm going to start working on that. So I'm just reading another comment. Working toward caring for a good death and post-death burial. It's slow to change, absolutely. One day forests on the edge of towns. Yes. Yeah, there was, where is that? I think that was in Melbourne. A company has come forward, and just like you have zones, what do you call them? A mental blank. Animals can travel through suburbs. You leave a little bit of forest here, so that corridors, wildlife corridors. They're talking also about cemetery corridors throughout suburbia. I don't think it'll ever take off, but that's what people are thinking about. And as we are starting to we overpopulate more, we have to start thinking about this. And you're absolutely right. We have to start changing the way we look at death, and maybe graveside or cemetery corridors through suburbs are the way to go. Again, it comes down to us, Western society. For decades, it's like, oh no, that's considered too morbid. I'm not going to the cemetery because of ghosts and it's scary and whatever else. Whereas now, the more we communicate, the more we respect the role that death plays in our lives, maybe people will come around and find it more accepting that the cemetery is closer to their house than it is now.
Right. Well, I think we've had a really interesting time here, Lisa, and we've come to 6:30, so we'll close now. But we really look forward to following you on Facebook and your website, and following the developments that you've talked about. And we wish you all the best in your endeavors. It's really wonderful what you're doing. We would all wish to be very supportive.
Thank you so very much for being so welcoming. And I love talking about this stuff, and I will do it till the day I die. But yeah, what started as just an interest and a hobby and trying to find information has turned into my life's work. So it's funny how things happen. So thank you very much for your enthusiastic listening and your wise questions. Thank you.
The merit of participating in this session. This virtuous accumulation of merit we offer so that all obstacles dissolve, and that at the time of our death each of us may find ease in dying and swift rebirth in the pure land of great bliss, quickly gaining enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. If the material presented today has raised any concerns for you, it's suggested you speak with a trusted friend, your personal health professional, or your Buddhist teacher or instructor. And in Living as Dying this year, we'll be hosting once monthly guest speakers. Our next guest speaker at 5:30 p.m. on Sunday, the 12th of March, will be Sarah Wilkinson on Curiosity Killed the Cat. And some of you will know Sarah from the monthly online Kowa Dunduk practices for the deceased. And we look forward to seeing you then. And thank you again, Lisa. It was really wonderful.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you. Yeah. So we'll say goodbye and see you next month.
Thank you. That was amazing. Yes, that was terrific. Thank you, Sarah.
Totally wonderful, Sarah. Really, really very interesting.
Yeah, and so joyful.
Yes,
So joyful. Yeah.
Raising funds for
so much enthusiasm.
Yes. Okay. Bye for now.
Bye for now.
See you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay.